How's it going, guys? Today I want to show you how to go from this to this. So first things first, if you guys want to follow along with the same RAW file that I'm editing, go ahead and download it in the link below. We're going to be editing this shot in two phases. The first is when we use our RAW processor. So I use Adobe Camera Raw. If you guys have Lightroom, it's exactly the same thing. You're going to have all the same exact tools that I use. Then in the second phase, we're going to jump over to Photoshop, where I'm going to add my personal stylized look to the shot as well as a little color grade. And I do use a couple of plugins. The first one is the Nik collection by Google. Right now it's free, but I think DxO is going to acquire it at some point, so I'm not sure what's going to happen down the line. The second one is called Lumenzia. It's made by a guy named Greg Benz, and what it is a tool to make luminosity masks based on the tonal values of your shot. I think that one's about 40 bucks, but they do have a free version that's a simplified tool set, so you can download that without having to bust out your wallet. To make it easier for you guys, I did put a link to Nik collection as well as Lumenzia in the description below. So this is the image that we're going to be editing today. I shot this with a Sony a7R Mark III. I used a adapted Samyang 14mm 2.8 lens. I shot it at 2.8, but because it's adapted, you're not going to see the readout here. You can see that I shot it at 30 seconds at ISO 4000. So let's go ahead and open it up. If you guys are using Lightroom, just go ahead and flip over to the Develop tab, and then you're going to get all these tools here. One of the first things I like to do is flip on over here to the Lens Correction tab. If you're using Lightroom, just scroll down and you're going to see a symbol that looks exactly like this. I have it set to default to remove chromatic aberrations, and then click the Enable Profile Corrections box. Like I said, this was an adapted lens. It was made for a Canon EF mount, so it didn't automatically pull the lens profile. So we're going to go ahead and select it manually from this list. So let's go down to Samyang, and then we're going to select the 14mm 2.8. Now what that does is it solves for any lens distortion that the image might have, as well as reduces the vignetting around the corners. So just with this little adjustment alone, you get a pretty big difference. The other thing I like to do right off the bat is to turn off sharpening. 99% of the time, you only want to sharpen your image after you find out what the final resolution is going to be. So if you're going to print this, you want to resize it to that particular resolution and then do your sharpening. Now that we've fixed the distortion of the image, we actually have a straight horizon. So let's go ahead and crop this down to an 8:10 ratio. So we're going to hit the crop tool, and we're going to select 4:5. And then we're going to hit the straighten tool and zoom in a bit just to trace the horizon. So if I let go of the mouse there, it's going to create a crop based on the aspect ratio that we selected with the crop tool. And now I can move this around, and I think I'm going to put the horizon on the bottom third. I'm going to hit enter, and there we go. So now let's go over to the basic adjustments tab. This is going to be towards the top if you're using Lightroom. Now obviously this image is way too warm, and for Milky Way shots I tend to lean towards cooler temperatures with a little bit of magenta in it. So let's go ahead and reduce the color temperature and then push it a little towards magenta. If you look down here, you'll notice that I have a vibrancy set to 40. For me, I think that's a good amount of color without being too saturated. So let's take a look at our tonal adjustments now. If we look at our histogram, you can see that most of our image is in the bottom half of the tonal range. So let's see if we can utilize more of this top half here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to exposure, and I'm going to increase this just a bit. We're going to skip contrast for now, and we're going to go down to highlights. By increasing the exposure, we kind of got this little washed out look. So let's see if we can recover some of the highlights by dragging this back down. Yeah, I think we got a little bit more detail back in the shot. Now let's go down to shadows and see if we can recover some of the foreground. I think somewhere around 35 is good. So now let's look at the white point. We can see that our image is still mostly in the bottom 2/3, so maybe we can increase the white point and use a little bit more of that top end. I think that's looking pretty great. Maybe recover a little bit more of the highlights. Something around there. So now if we take a look at our histogram here, we're clearly occupying more of the tonal range. So let's see what happens when we add a bit of contrast. Cool, I think that's looking pretty good. I'm going to hit P on my keyboard and it's going to bring us back to what we started out with. So this is before. Most of the image is in the bottom half of the tonal range again. If I hit P again on the keyboard, we see our after. You can see we're utilizing a lot more of the tonal range in our histogram. So now let's take a look at some local adjustments. So we have our radial filter here as well as our graduated filter. If you guys are using Lightroom, these tools are going to show up right at the top of your tool pane underneath your histogram. With these tools, you can make adjustments just to specific parts of the image. So I'm going to use the radial tool first. And what you do is you can click and drag just to highlight a specific part of the image. In this case, I'm going to select the galactic center and highlight that. If you've ever used these in the past, it's going to pull the settings that you had previously. So let's go ahead and reset that to start out with. And that's going to zero out all these values. So I've got my selection around the galactic center of the Milky Way. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to increase my exposure a tad. And as you can see by doing that, we got this washed out look. And to fix that, we're going to adjust our black point so that the darker parts of the image match the surrounding area. So let's drag this down. Looks like -40 gets us there. And then I'll add a bit of contrast and a tiny bit of clarity. So let's click and drag this thing away to see what we had before. And then we'll move it back. And that's what we have after. You can see that it pops just a little bit more. The other thing I might use this radial tool for is to bring out some detail in these rocks here. So let's make a selection around the rocks. And again, it's going to copy the settings from the previous adjustment. So let's go ahead and reset that. And let's start with exposure. Crank that up a bit. So I'm noticing that I'm getting this magenta tinge, probably because it was underexposed. And what I do to compensate for that is I just bring the tint a little towards green. So we have recovered some detail, but now our problem is the brighter tones of this adjustment. You can see that this is a lot brighter than the surrounding area. So just like how we brought the black point down here to match this surrounding area, we're going to try and reduce the white point so that it matches this area. So let's bring the white back down to something like -45. Now let's see if we can do something similar for these rocks down here. Again, it copied the settings from the previous adjustment, so we're going to go ahead and reset it and start from the beginning. So let's go down to exposure. Looks like we're probably going to have to increase the shadows as well. And again, to solve for that magenta tinge, let's go ahead and lean the tint towards green. And now let's match the brighter tones to the surrounding area by reducing the white point. And I think we're good. If we click back to the zoom tool, you can take a look at the image without all those overlays. And I think that's definitely an improvement. The last thing I think I'll do is use the graduated filter. And I think I'm going to try and create an artificial vignette in these bottom corners. I'm not going to adjust the sky because I like how it's evenly exposed. So I'm just going to drag here from the corner inward. And just like the radial tool, it's copying the same settings that I was using earlier. So let's go ahead and reset it. And for this, I'm going to reduce my temperature just a tad to add some color contrast. Then I'm going to reduce my exposure as well as my contrast. Now I'm going to do the same thing from the other corner. And because this is the exact same adjustment, I'm just going to leave the settings that I used for the other side. So again, let's go back to the zoom tab and zoom out a bit. So there we go. At this point, we have a pretty complete image. I mean, if you guys just have Lightroom, you might want to go and use the spot removal tool to maybe remove these rocks here in the foreground and maybe this bright star here in the corner. Both of those are kind of distracting, but other than that, go ahead and add some noise reduction and you've got a pretty solid final image. If you guys want to stick around and see how I add my personal stylized look to these shots, we're going to go ahead and jump on over to Photoshop. So I'm going to hit Open Image. If you guys are using Lightroom, just right-click the image thumbnail and say Open in Photoshop. I do use a couple of plugins. The first one is the Nick Collection. Now, just as a side note, if you guys are using Photoshop CC 2018 specifically, you have to use this selective tool. Otherwise, it'll crash. So if you don't see this window pop up when you open Photoshop, go ahead and hit File, Automate, and Nick Collection Selective Tool. Normally, you would just be able to go to Filters and hit Nick Collection and choose any one of these effects. But in this later version, it crashes every time you try to apply. So let's use this selective tool, and I'm going to hit Color Effects Pro 4. If you guys have ever used this plugin before, it's just going to put the last filter that you ended up using. So I'm just going to delete this. And for Milky Way shots, the first thing I like to do is I like to add a filter called Pro Contrast. And the only slider that I really touch is this thing called Dynamic Contrast. If you guys drag this all the way to the right, you can kind of see what it does. It's a little similar to Clarity, where it creates local contrast on a finer detail level. But for the most part, it does a pretty good job of avoiding halos when it comes to edges like this over here. For me, I like to stick somewhere between 15 and 20. I think that's good. Now to add another effect, we're going to hit this button that says Add Filter. And that creates an empty slot for us to add another filter in. If I didn't hit that button and I clicked on one of these, it would replace this adjustment that I had there. So now I have this empty slot, and I'm going to select a filter called Contrast Color Range. Now this filter has some preset values, so we're just going to zero these out. And this one's a little weird. As you can see, that didn't really do anything. For some odd reason, you have to wiggle this brightness adjustment, and then it'll go back to neutral. With this filter, what it's going to do is create color contrast based on the color selected here. So right now, the warmer tones are selected here. So if I increase the color contrast, you can see that these yellow orangey hues are getting a little bit brighter, as well as in this area. But you got these purple bluish tones that are getting darker. With this, you want to be pretty conservative, so I like to stick to somewhere around 20 to 30%. Now I'm going to hit the Add Filter button, and I'm going to add a filter called Contrast Only. Again, it's preset to 50%, and we're going to just zero that out. So with this filter, I'm going to add this soft contrast. I'm going to take it up to about 30%. What soft contrast does is it basically creates contrast on a broader scale. So it'll take a look at this entire area and say, okay, this is predominantly bright, and I'm going to create contrast to the surrounding area, which is mostly dark up here and down here. The next thing I'm going to do is reduce my contrast only by about 10%. And you're probably asking, why would I do that? Why would I go through all the trouble of adding these adjustments if I was just going to reduce the contrast later? Personally, I think the most important thing with any image is how it looks as a whole. Is the composition strong? Is there a clear subject? Then all of these finer details are kind of secondary. So I'm making sure that the details are there if you look closely, but I want to make sure that they don't take away from the image as a whole when you step back. And because soft contrast is looking at the image on a broader scale, it actually helps the composition. Now the last thing I'm going to do is increase my brightness just a tad, as well as add a bit of saturation. Now I'm starting to get this nice filmic look where the black point is raised just a bit. Now the last filter I like to add is called the Skylight filter. By default, it's set to 20. It's a little strong for my personal taste, so I'm going to dial it back down to about 10%. What the Skylight filter does essentially is it shifts the midtones towards a warmer color, and then as you taper off to the highlights, it starts to shift towards magenta. So I'm pretty happy with that. Let's go ahead and hit OK, and it's going to apply that filter to a new layer in our Photoshop composition. So there we go. I'm going to close out this selective tool because I'm not going to be using the Nick collection anymore. Now I think what I might want to do now is increase the darker tones of this foreground and make them a little bit brighter. And for that, I'm going to use Lumenzia. Now I can't get to some of the tools at the bottom here because I reduced the resolution of my screen so I can make this video. So I'm just going to grab this thing and create a separate pane. So this is Lumenzia. Basically, what these buttons do is create luminosity masks based on the tone of your image. So if I click on any of these, it'll create a black and white representation of the selection. So I'm looking at these darker tones here in the foreground. So let's see what these selections will give me. I think D4 is pretty good. So if I create an adjustment based on this color mask, it's only going to adjust the portions of the image that are white, and then the black portions are going to be left alone. So I'm going to click here on the curves adjustment, and it's going to create a curves adjustment with that color mask. I'm going to move this pane away so I can see my properties. So here's the new layer, and here's the curve adjustment. So I'm just going to drag this up a bit. And because I have this mask on, it's just affecting the darker portions of the image here at the bottom and just a little bit on the top. Let's turn that off and on just to see what the before and after is like. I think I was a little heavy-handed, so I'm going to reduce the opacity just a tad. Maybe bring it down to something like 60% or so. So now I think what I want to do is get rid of these rocks here in the foreground as well as this bright star. I think it's a little bit distracting. So I'm going to go up here and create a new layer. Hit OK. And I'm going to use my healing brush. I want to make sure that sample all layers is checked. Otherwise it's going to be sampling nothing because this is an empty layer. And I'm just going to zoom in here to these rocks and brush this thing out. It's pretty good. Now let's go over to this little star reflection. That's pretty good. And I think I want to get rid of this one too. Now let's zoom out. I think I still got some weird thing down in the corner there. Let me paint that guy out. There we go. The other thing I'm noticing is this little starburst here that seems to be just off frame. So let me zoom in and see if I can get rid of that. And there we go. Now if I was going to print this, obviously I would want to zoom in and find all of these little dead pixels right here that you can see and use the spot heal brush to fix all of them. But I'm not planning to print this, so I'm going to skip that for now. The other thing you'll probably want to do is noise reduction. My favorite tool for that is the Nik Collection Define 2 filter, but let's save that for another video. So finally, let's just group all of these adjustments into one folder. I'm going to click on the top layer, and then I'm going to shift click on this color effects layer that we created at the start. And I'm going to hit Command G. If you're using a PC, it's going to be Control G. And that's going to create a group. And what we can do is we can turn this off and turn it back on just to see a little before and after of our little color grade. So here I opened up a copy of the original image. I did go ahead and fix the white balance, and I did apply the lens correction just to factor those two things out. So this is what we had before, and here's our final edit. So that's how I typically edit a shot of the Milky Way. If you guys have questions or if you want to see me edit something specific, definitely hit me up in the comments below. And if you guys want to see more videos like this, I hope you subscribe. But other than that, my name is Kavika with 9th Ave Studio, and I will see you guys in the next video. Shoots!